harness this darkness within.
So, some new Lords of the Fallen 2 news just dropped. First off, something I think we all already knew, it's been delayed till early 2027. All the games coming out over the holiday season, plus the juggernaut of GTA 6 was just too much for CI Games and had to be pushed back. But on the other side of the news, as most of you know, Lords of the Fallen 2 is being developed in Unreal Engine 5, with interesting next-gen environments, lighting, all those shiny nooks and crannies, with some seriously impressive designs from an artistic standpoint. The problem is that whenever people hear Unreal Engine 5 these days, the reaction isn't always excitement. Fair or not, UE5 has developed a reputation over the last few years, as many of us have seen the performance issues with stuttering, frame rate drops, shader issues, and all kinds of other garbage. Every time a new game announces it's using the engine, the same conversation starts all over again. Of course, Unreal Engine isn't the only major engine out there. You've got things like Unity and the Creation Engine with their own issues, even the RE engine, which is probably the best one at the moment. But still, every engine has strengths and weaknesses, and at the end of the day, most players don't really care about what's under the hood as long as the game runs well when it launches. That brings us to Lords of the Fallen 2 because both CI Games and Unreal Engine have been talking about the project recently, starting with Marek Tymiński, the CEO of CI Games, posting about Unreal Engine 5 on X. UE5 is a very strong engine. We have a great team that understands it extremely well, and their knowledge goes way beyond just Unreal Engine itself. We want to deliver Lords 2 in a very good state right at launch, and I think it's very achievable. Now, if you follow Lords of the Fallen since launch, you can probably understand why people immediately focus on that last part. A good state right at launch is probably where most of us worry about the game. The original received a huge number of updates after release, and the team spent a long-ass time improving performance, fixing bugs, and making adjustments based on player feedback, and, let's be honest, we were probably the bug testers for CI Games. No studio is going to come out and tell people they're expecting performance problems. What interested me more was everybody else's reaction underneath it, as I could already see that opinions are all over the place, as pretty much every opinion you can imagine showed up in the replies. One of the first replies that stood out to me was actually a pretty positive one. It's great you managed to get procedural generation to work for Umbral. I bet that saved months of development. Even with the obvious touches here and there, Game of the Year 2026. There are definitely people who are becoming more optimistic about Lords of the Fallen 2 the more they see of it. Every time CI Games releases another Lifting the Veil episode, the response seems a little more positive than the last one. Whether that's because people like the direction they're taking with the sequel, or because they appreciate how open the developers have been about discussing the game, the mood around Lords 2 feels much better than it did several months ago. Then we also have people that aren't nearly as convinced. Sorry, but no. It's a horrific, resource-wasteful engine. Whether you manage to rein it into something functional with Lords remains to be seen. That aside, I'm more worried about how poorly implemented keyboard and mouse will be. Now, he probably feels about the same as lots of us do every single time Unreal Engine 5 gets mentioned. A lot of us have been burned by inconsistent performance or optimization problems that take months or even years to sort out. Some people blame the engine, some the developers, maybe even both. Wherever you fall in that debate, it's not hard to understand why people are cautious. And let's be honest, nobody is looking at Lords of the Fallen 2 and saying it doesn't look impressive, especially the art direction. Performance, on the other hand, is the thing people keep coming back to. Then there were some comments that landed somewhere in between. I will always be hesitant of UE5 because the majority of games run like ass. However, I am willing to play Lords 2 even despite that. Creation Kit is an engine abused by Bethesda, but it makes some of the most fun games, as long as there is not political bait and switch, obviously. Well, he's got a point. If you played Skyrim, Fallout, Oblivion, or Starfield, you've probably heard people complain about that engine for years. At the same time, those games still managed to attract huge audiences because people enjoyed what the games themselves were doing. I also do feel the frustration behind political messaging. It comes up so often in gaming conversations these days. Personally, I don't think current day politics has much of a place in a medieval dark fantasy setting like Lords of the Fallen. When I'm playing a game like this, I'm looking for a cool world to explore, great combat, interesting bosses, and a story that fits the setting the developers created. At the end of the day though, most of the conversation underneath Marek's post seemed to circle back to the same question. Can CI Games actually make UE5 work the way players want it to? Well, Epic and Unreal had something to say about it. Because shortly after all of this, Unreal Engine released a post featuring Lords of the Fallen 2. Lords of the Fallen 2, the latest dark fantasy action RPG from CI Games, uses UE5 to craft a vast, war-torn kingdom crumbling from within. Alongside that post, they also released a short interview with members of the development team discussing how they're using Unreal Engine 5 and some of the lessons they have learned while building the sequel. What I liked about this video is that it doesn't spend 5 minutes telling us that Unreal Engine 5 is amazing or that Lords of the Fallen 2 is going to be bigger and better than ever. They get into actual development details fairly quickly. And some of the things they talked about were pretty interesting. One thing that became clear almost immediately is how much more comfortable the team seems with the tech now compared to when they were making the first game. At one point, they even talk about wanting to push everything a step further with the sequel, and mention that they understand the engine much better than they did before. This has a lot to do with how they worked on Umbral this time around, and they even gave us real examples of how the engine is actually helping the team build Lords of the Fallen 2 differently.
In the previous game, we did everything completely manual. So we built Axiom, and then on top of Axiom, we built everything in Umbral. Of course, this was incredibly time-consuming, but now for Lords of the Fallen 2, thanks to the Unreal Procedural Generation Framework, what we are able to do is build Axiom, and they set some parameters, and tweakable by artists, of course, that they are able to populate all the Umbral with all the horrendous things that we have in there.
In the original Lords, the team basically had to create both worlds separately. They built Axiom first, and then they had to manually build the Umbral version on top of that. Considering that Umbral is one of the main ideas behind the entire series, that means every change, every area, and every piece of the world had to be considered twice. That's a huge amount of work. Now, with Lords of the Fallen 2, they're using procedural generation tools to speed up that process. But I think it's important to explain what they actually mean here, because when people hear that, they think random slop rooms and AI assets. That doesn't seem to be what CI Games is describing though.
Of course, procedural generation does not mean that artists do not have control. In Unreal, the PCG framework allows to do tons of things, like put specific volumes to say, here I want this, or here I actually don't want schools, for instance, or whatever.
So this has essentially enabled us to create our second realm almost immediately.
The way they explain it, artists are still controlling the final results. They can set rules, decide where certain things appear, and even shape the world instead of just letting the system create everything on its own. This is probably where Unreal Engine starts becoming more than just a graphics upgrade. The benefit is that the team can create the foundation of the world much faster, then spend more time refining the parts players actually experience.
So now going forward, procedural generated content is now an integral part of our pipeline going forward from this game to all of the games.
That last part is also interesting because this will change the way they build games moving forward. Hopefully this means that'll help them solve problems faster instead of the issues they had with Lords 2023. But of course, visuals and development tools are only part of the conversation. The biggest concern with Unreal Engine 5 right now is still going to be performance, and that leads into probably the most important part of this entire interview.
When we released the last title, I would say the biggest lesson we learned was performance and optimization. And this has formed how we look at our dual role systems, how we look at our gas systems, how we look at just player movement, combat. Absolutely everything has performance in mind.
This is the section that I think a lot of players are going to pay the most attention to. Game feel and optimization were way off when the game first launched. So hearing the devs talk about this directly is definitely the most important thing they could have talked about, with this even changing how certain systems work within the game. But of course, they gotta test it.
We use Unreal Insights and automated testing a lot to make like double realm gameplay happen for single player, multiplayer. From all our levels, everything is automated and get basically daily results.
So they embrace the idea of constantly checking everything before an issue happens, even checking for performance drops in some of the more heavily detailed areas.
For example, we have splines that run through the level autonomously, essentially judging where things are going to spike, what areas of concern that we need to then touch or optimize. It can even spawn player abilities to essentially mimic a real gaming situation. So this is just running constantly and allowing us to not waste our efforts trying to find where things dip, but being told where things go.
So basically stuff we players never see, but a game like Lords 2 has a lot of moving parts. You have the two worlds, enemies existing even when you aren't directly looking at them, the new combat systems they've added, multiplayer, and all the other things happening behind the scenes. The challenge is making all of those ideas work together without creating performance problems. So this leads us back to whose fault it is. Honestly, I think a lot of it depends on how the developers build, test, and optimize the experience around it. Based on what they showed here, CI Games seems to know that performance is the area where they need to prove themselves. The question now is whether all of this preparation actually translates into a smoother launch when we finally get our greedy paws on it. And so there's always one final test a game has to pass. how does it actually feel to play?
Something that we wanted to really push forward within this is more autonomy for the developers themselves. And the gameplay ability system has literally been a layer on top where our teams can essentially go in, they can tune how a boss acts, they can tune how enemies like cool down, they can tune when they engage and when they disengage.
So this is one of those things that probably won't stand out in a trailer, but it could have a pretty big impact on the final game. You see, the developers are talking about giving the design team more control over combat systems without needing to rely on programmers for every single adjustment. Instead of making a small change and having to rebuild parts of the system, designers can directly adjust things like enemy behavior, cooldowns, attacks, and how encounters work. They even give a nifty example.
To put an example, for us, if we have a boss that suddenly starts rushing at you, jumps and throws a big ability from the air that causes tons of explosions, that is zero programming for us. Designers are able to create all that using data.
Meaning that they'll be able to test these new ideas much faster than before. For a game like Lords 2, where combat is such a major part of the experience, being able to quickly change how enemies behave or how a boss encounter feels could really improve the experience for players. Most of the bosses from Lords 2023 look cool, but weren't nearly as fun to fight. Lords 2, combat systems could get small changes to timing, enemy reactions, attack patterns, and difficulty, which could completely change how an encounter feels. So while this isn't something we will see directly, it could influence one of the more important parts of the game, how satisfying combat feels moment to moment. And alongside all of these single-player improvements, the team also talked about something that has become a much bigger expectation for modern games: co-op. Specifically, how they're building crossplay.
The backbone of our multiplayer is the Epic Online services, and that allows us to connect players and friends across all consoles, platforms, and wherever they play.
So here they double down on Epic. Its online services handle basically everything. Plus, it seems like Epic will be upgrading its services pretty soon. Either way, if something goes wrong, we know who to blame. Hopefully, co-op will feel more seamless when we're connected with friends and move between platforms without having to deal with a lot of technical problems behind the scenes. I know some people are all about multiplayer in Souls-likes, and I think CI Games seems very aware of what they need to focus on. So after everything shown in the interview, I think the Unreal Engine 5 conversation around Lords 2 becomes a lot more complicated. I mean, our concerns are pretty understandable. Over the last few years, we've seen some dog-water optimization for games using UE5. But for CI Games, the biggest improvements they talked about are not only going to be visual, changing how they work with Umbral, how they test performance, how they develop combat systems, heck, even how they handle multiplayer as a whole. Of course, none of this guarantees that Lords 2 will launch perfectly. They can add all the buzzwords they want, but at the end of the day, we are the final judges. The biggest thing I took away from this is that CI Games seems to understand what we're watching for. The sequel needs to look great, but it also needs to run well and deliver a smoother experience than the first game did at launch. So now the real question is, do you think Unreal Engine 5 deserves the criticism it gets, or do you think devs like CI Games are starting to show what the engine is actually capable of? So I think that's all from me for now. So as always, if you enjoyed the video, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And I'll see you all in the next one.
Unreal like a weapon, like the lamp bearer with a great sword. We understood the engine now. We understood what it can do, how it can push our features even further.